Dark Ages, half of Britain stubbornly resisted barbarian invasion. Here were laid the foundations of what later became Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. This was the world of the Celts.
Far more than half of Britain lies beyond the area of Anglo-Saxon settlement in the early Middle Ages, a very large area. The sources of our information about it are limited and difficult to use, but though we must always be aware of the limitations of the evidence, we do know some things, and we do know that these parts of Britain can't be reduced to a uniformly fuzzy background of wild natives. If you know anything about these areas at this time, you will probably have come across two predominant popular images: the image of heroic society on the one hand, and of a proliferation of ascetic saints on the other. I'm going to talk about this part of Britain during the period of Saxon settlement and consolidation. That is, from the 5th to the 8th century. I'm going to begin by considering these popular images and their value. The image of heroic society is dominated by war bands, men attracted from afar to the leadership of a famous lord, drinking in the halls of their leaders before going out to battle, receiving gifts and fighting faithfully in return. This, the image of military lordship, is powerfully and memorably expressed in the long set of early Welsh stanzas known as the Gododdin. Like most of the genre, this is a poem of defeat. In a shining array, they fed together around the wine vessel. My heart has become full of grief for the feast of Mynyddig. I have lost too many of my true kinsmen. Out of 300 who hastened to Catraeth, alas, none escaped but for one man. The one hero was a blessed, active man. He was a wearer of a broad mail coat. He was fierce, he was rash on the back of his horse. The other image, by contrast, is of physical passivity, of holy men who retreated from society in search of spiritual purity, without material comfort. This image is repeatedly conveyed by the lives of saints. So, in the late 11th century, the cleric Rigavach wrote of St. David: knowing that carefree rest was the source and the mother of vices, the Holy Father bowed down the shoulders of the monks with pious labours. After matins, he sought cold water, remaining in it sufficiently long to subdue all the ardours of the flesh. The whole of the day he spent inflexibly and unweariedly in teaching, praying, genuflecting, and in care of the brethren. So, we are conditioned to think of men fighting a desperate last-ditch stand, or on the other hand, fighting the spiritual battle, retreating into sanctity. Now, both of these images are misleading. Why? Two particular reasons. Firstly, the written sources which express the images derive from later periods. Both types of source are much more useful evidence of the values and attitudes of the societies which produced them than evidence about events of 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. The second reason is that these popular images conceal differences between societies and divert attention from earlier sources. The island of Britain is an area of considerable geographical variety. Mountainous areas, like North Wales and Highland Scotland, do not support the same sort of living as rich farmlands like those in Fife or the Vale of Glamorgan. Whereas in the past, people in Glamorgan depended essentially on farming, life in the western coastlands of Scotland depended largely on the sea. Such differences in environment didn't just condition the view from the front door, for the richer lands would have produced a surplus, and the poorer would have supported no more than basic subsistence. And where there was a surplus, it might have been sufficient to support the leisure and greater consumption of an aristocracy. So, geographical differences might condition the type of social group that the land supported. There was also linguistic diversity. Two distinct language groups were represented, Goidelic and Brittonic, and possibly a third in the problematic Pictish language. Goidelic included primitive Irish, which was spoken in western Scotland and probably in parts of West Wales and Cornwall too. Brittonic languages were spoken south of the Forth and Clyde, separating in western parts during this period into the distinct but mutually intelligible languages of primitive Cumbric, primitive Welsh, and primitive Cornish. Pictish was probably spoken in most of Scotland north of the Forth Clyde line, except for the west coast. Its southern form was Brittonic, but it may have had a different northern form, totally obscure to us now. Not entirely rationally, but conditioned by these linguistic distinctions, it's conventional to distinguish three peoples, Irish, Pictish, British, in non-English Britain. If the two traditional images are inadequate, what more can be said? What was happening to these peoples between the 5th and 8th centuries? There are two kinds of political development that had a lasting significance: migration and the emergence of kings. Migration. The 5th and 6th century wasn't just a period of English immigration into eastern and southern England. It was a period of Celtic movement too. Some British left Britain and settled on the continent, especially in France, giving their name and perhaps their language to Brittany. Others moved within the island. More significantly for the future development of Britain, there was movement into Britain from Ireland, and these Irish, known as Scotti, ultimately gave their name to Scotland. The Irish movement affected at least Cornwall, Dyfed and Gwynedd, including Anglesey, as well as southwest Scotland, as we know from evidence such as monuments bearing the Irish script known as Ogham, like this 6th century stone from Ivybridge in Devon. There are two names inscribed on the stone, which presumably mark their place of burial. So, the name Fanoni Macerini is inscribed vertically on the face in Latin and along the corner in Ogham. The other face and corner bear the name Sagrani. The Irish movement to British parts probably took place in the late 4th and 5th century. For Scotland, there is precise evidence of such movement from Ireland in the later 6th century. Rulers of the Ulster peoples known as Ullid raided overseas, and one of the Ullid dynasties, the Dol Riada, established themselves as kings in Scotland as well as Ireland. So, population movement is characteristic of many areas, not all, in the first half of our period. British people moved overseas and perhaps west. Irish people moved into western coastal areas. Now, from migration to kings. Irish, Pictish, British, beginning with British. The second clear political development, and in many ways the most striking, is that kingdoms appeared in British Britain, that is, in Wales, the West, and the Scottish lowlands. These areas had previously been included within the provinces of Roman Britain, and were therefore subject at that time to Roman government, although the south and the east had been more Romanized than north and west. We know of at least 14 of them, from Romanized as well as unromanized parts. If evidence were less fragmentary, I'm sure we'd know of more. In one case, Glywysing in southeast Wales, the process of the kingdom's formation can be outlined as it happened during the 7th century. A warrior called Mairig, of unknown origin, perhaps foreign, suddenly appears in the Chepstow area. He assumes control of the Wye Valley, marries the Ergin king's daughter, then takes control of the Vale of Glamorgan and Gower, displacing Gower kings. His descendants continued the process until his great-grandson, Ithel, established a single consolidated kingdom. This pattern wasn't necessarily typical of other kingdoms. The kingdoms as a whole clearly varied and ranged from a rather large Dumnonia in the south, Cornwall, Devon, probably West Somerset, as you can see on the map, to a tiny Erging and a tiny Gower in south-west Hereford and Gower, to a not much larger Elmet near Leeds, possibly a huge Rheged on both sides of the Pennines, to a substantial Strathclyde focused on the River Clyde. Most of these are clearly evidenced by the early 6th century. We must therefore presume that they were created during the 5th century, the migration period, a time of obvious instability. The nature of these British kingdoms was such that kings controlled territories rather than tribal groups, doubtless by the use of the warriors who were their companions. When they died, they passed on their authority to members of their families, establishing dynasties. They had very little machinery of government, no more than a few agents to do whatever business turned up. Very little sense of office or responsibility. So they may seem insignificant to us, but the fact that these kingdoms emerged at all is of considerable importance for the future development of Wales and the West. Turning from British to Picts and Irish, it looks as if the pattern of development among those peoples was different. We certainly know of Pictish kings from the late 6th century on, but I shouldn't be happy to assume kingship for development of this period. It could well be a continuation of an ancient tradition. Whatever the number of Pictish kingdoms at the outset, there seems to have been a single consolidated Pictish kingship by the late 8th century, and there are hints that Pictish kings were developing some machinery of government at least by that time. There's a reference to some officers of King Nectan in 729, known as exactatores. The name, exactatores, strongly suggests some tax collecting capacity. In the west of Scotland, the Irish side, we've already seen that the Dál Riada were an implantation from Ireland. A single unitary kingship seems, as in the east, to have emerged by the 8th century, and here too there may have been some institutional development by the 7th century. Details about the activities of kings from all areas is almost entirely confined to warfare. If they did other things, we don't hear about them. Border warfare with the English in British Britain, and a complex pattern of military relationships between Irish, Picts, British and English in southern and central Scotland, although the English defeat in 685 and subsequent withdrawal left Scotland effectively controlled by Pictish and Irish kings. Now, if kings were fighting, what were others doing? All peoples were living through marked changes in their physical environment. In the former Roman provinces, there was contraction in size, deterioration of fabric at urban sites, and also a lack of repair and frequent abandonment of country houses. Of course, characteristically Roman structures didn't disappear, but their use might well change. So Roman forts, like Caerhun in North Wales, became the sites of churches. Some people, probably kings and leaders, began living on hilltop sites in the 5th century, enclosing small areas for their protection. This happened from Tintagel on the north coast of Cornwall, to Dinas Powys near Cardiff, to Dinas Emrys near Snowdonia, to Dumbarton, focus of the British kingdom of Strathclyde, and Dunad, focus of the Dál Riada, a picture of which you saw just now, and Dundurn on the edge of the Pictish heartland. Other places, rural, less significant centres of consumption than the hill forts, though by no means squalid or uncomfortable, show signs of being inhabited, both in the Roman period and beyond. Here, change or abandonment often came in the 7th century rather than the 5th. In fact, in the long term, changes in the settlement pattern may well have been influenced by large-scale environmental change, by a climatic deterioration that brought colder, wetter weather, a deterioration that limited productive capacity in higher and more northern areas, and that therefore made farming of some parts uneconomic. In such cases, people had to move to more favourable localities. The entire period, from the 4th to the 8th century, was probably one of settlement shift, a shift conditioned by fundamental economic determinants, like climate, as well as by political and cultural factors, like migration. Now, turning from environment to behaviour, what did non-royal people do? Some very broad outlines can be indicated for British social structure in Wales, the West and the Scottish lowlands. British society, where we can perceive it, was a stratified society in which there was differentiation between rich and poor, and between superior and inferior. At the least, an aristocracy, a slave group, and a stratum of those who were neither, although there were probably finer distinctions than this. These were slave-owning societies in which slavery persisted for longer than was normal in Europe. Most would have been born slaves, but we do know of a Saxon woman who formed part of the payment handed over in a sale in southeast Wales round about 740. It's quite likely that one of the additional distinctive strata was one of tied tenants. Some of the agrarian labour force were born tenants and obliged to remain such, returning at least an annual render to their landlords. This undoubtedly limited their personal freedom, but they were not themselves chattels, as slaves were, and there are no suggestions that they were bound to perform labour services for their landlords. It was landlords, that's laymen and clerics and monasteries, landlords who conducted local business, who saw to the regulation of transactions and the settlement of disputes. In southeast Wales, they were known as elders and were clearly small farmers rather than great aristocrats. Public meetings drew people from an area of perhaps 15 miles radius, but not much more. One record of the settlement of a property dispute nicely demonstrates the role of elders. It was written onto a page of the Lichfield Gospels for safekeeping when the Gospels were at Llandail which is not far from Carmarthen, in the 8th or 9th century. Tydfil arose to claim the Telly estate, which was in the hands of Elgi and the people of Iorwerth. He quarrelled a long time about it. In the end, they overcame Tydfil's claim. The elders said, "Let's make peace." Afterwards, Elgi gave a horse, 3 cows, and 3 newly calved cows, so that there might not be enmity between them from the reconciliation until Judgment Day. Thenceforth, Tydfil and his family would not hold a deed. The last sentence reminds us of the importance of family bonds, for Tydfil's family was affected by this settlement. There's other evidence on this subject. The wider family, the kindred, will have had some role in relation to property and marriage and assault. That means uncles and cousins would have been involved in the transmission of property in some circumstances and in the arrangement of marriages, and uncles and cousins would have been responsible for damage caused by one of their kin and would have received compensation for damage caused to their members. But don't imagine that everything was done with second cousins and great-grandfathers tottering along. The nuclear family seems to have been the basic residential group with a tight relationship which took precedence over the others. St. Sampson's mother looked after the young child and was even concerned about his play. The wife of Bishop Bivatigos was very precious to him, as this tombstone from Anglesey quite remarkably records. Overall, the social support which we expect in the modern state was largely provided by family and also by lordship structures. That goes for economic support too. However, nothing suggests that these mechanisms of social support extended to slaves and tied tenants, though economic support obviously did. Their personal security seems to have been a fragile thing, and there's no evidence of any machinery adequate to support such individuals. Outside British areas of Britain, among the Picts and the Irish, it's even more difficult than this to perceive social structures at this very early period. Virtually nothing can be said about Pictish society. However, you should know that matrilineal succession was probably usual in the royal family. This means that kings were selected from the sons of royal women, not royal men. So, a king's nephew or brother would tend to succeed him rather than his son. Secondly, Pictland has many symbol stones of this period, quite large monuments carved with curious and intricate designs, but with virtually no clues to meaning, apart from some Christian associations, as you see here, and from the portrayal of warrior groups. All sorts of ingenious attempts have been made to fashion social structures from these pictures. At present, they remain ingenious, but unprovable. More positively, the life of St Columba, written by Addofnan, abbot of Iona, round about 700, allows a few glimpses into Scottish society, although it isn't always possible to distinguish between Irish and Pictish parts. Much of it, however, is about the Irish. There are the same indications of social stratification, of the strength of the nuclear family, but role of the wider kindred for some purposes, of slaves and of tied tenants, of military lordship, as there are in British areas. And these norms are also suggested by other later texts. Let me gather these threads together. If you attempted to suppose that outside the area of Anglo-Saxon settlement there was one great pan-Celtic society in Britain, it's clear that there was not. At the very least, there were significant differences between Irish, Pictish, and British areas. There were major political and environmental differences between one region and another, from county to county in modern terms. And if there were more detailed early texts, we could shade in the different operation of kinship and lordship structures and the differing definitions of noble and non-noble strata as we moved from place to place. The traditional images with which I began, saints and heroes, have a grain of truth in them, but it's only a grain. Heroic society is about leaders and about aristocrats, and it relates to border areas. It's not about the mass of the population, and it's not about a large part of Britain. Sainthood there may well have been. Indeed, the spread of Christianity must itself constitute one of the greatest social changes of this period in all areas. This is a change which not only affected ritual practice, it's a change which affected economic fundamentals too. For saints received endowments. Churches and monasteries and their communities became very rapidly landowners. So the tenant population acquired new and new kinds of landlord, and they often acquired fewer and therefore richer landlords. The stronger images, therefore, are of small-scale, inward-looking, agrarian societies with little consciousness of a wider world. Kings and their war bands rushed round above them, impinging little on everyday life. But the new monastic landlords were nearer at home, and their interests were in agrarian exploitation. Let me end with some alternative images to set against the romantic ones with which I began. From Addofnan's Life of Columba. But concerning a certain very niggardly rich man who had slighted St. Columba and did not receive him as a guest, the saint pronounced this prophetic doom. The riches of that greedy man who has spurned Christ in pilgrim guests will from this day be gradually diminished and will be reduced to nothing. And he himself will be a beggar, and he will die, struck with an axe by one of his enemies in the trench of the threshing floor. All these things were completely fulfilled. And another piece, again written into the margins of the Lichfield Gospels, then known as St. Tyler's Gospels, right at the end of our period. It's necessary to inscribe some letters to the effect that the 4 sons of Blethery have given freedom to Blythid, son of Cillian, and his seed forever, for a price. And this is the confirmation that he gave 4 pounds and 8 ounces of silver for his freedom. It was done in front of law-worthy witnesses, Rhuathan, Arthur, Bishop Nobis, Dubrinus his son, and so on. Whoever shall preserve this decree of freedom for Blythid and his seed shall be blessed. He who does not preserve it shall be cursed by God and by Tyler, in whose Gospels it is written. The saint was a man of power and knew it and used it. The hero needed the slave if he was to indulge in feasting and fighting. And the getting of food absorbed most people most of the time.
The next program tells the story of how Christianity came to Britain.